Hello and welcome. Today I would like to make the first of what will probably be 2 or 3 videos introducing you to Vasily Grossman's novel, Life and Fate. Here's the novel, the Everyman's Library edition. This is Grossman himself on the cover. He was a war correspondent for the military newspaper Red Star in the Soviet Union. He was at the Battle of Stalingrad, the Nazi siege of Stalingrad in 1942 and 43. It's the main subject of this novel. And he was well known in the Soviet Union as a journalist. He also published, early on in the war, a shorter novel called The People Immortal. And in that novel, he creates a sort of rousing patriotic feeling intended to encourage the Soviet citizenry. Life and Fate is an entirely different creature. It is about 860 pages long. It is sometimes called the War and Peace of the 20th century, and with good reason, I think. It is about war, but it is also more ambitious in its scope than almost any other novel of the 20th century that I'm aware of. It treats war and human relationships and human psychology in an absolutely realistic and probing way. It is tremendously persuasive because of this. In order to approach this novel, I think one has to have a fair knowledge of Soviet history and 20th century history. One has to know what Grossman assumed all his Russian readership would know. What's a Menshevik? What is the significance of the year 1937? A character will say to another character, just like 1937, and it's understood what that means. I think we have to reach a certain level of knowledge in order to approach this book and glean from it just part of its depths. And so this first video will be largely a historical account, giving some of the background on the world the novel depicts. As I said, it depicts the world of the Stalingrad siege of 1942 and 1943. It assumes that the reader knows what happened in 1941, and we will go through these matters. The novel itself was a very bold novel for Grossman to write because it takes on the Stalinist bureaucracy. It takes on Stalin himself. It is unflinching and honest, and that honesty extends to its treatment of the Soviet government and Joseph Stalin himself. For that reason, the book was, as Polly Jones says in her fine introduction to this edition of the book, the book was arrested. Grossman tried to have it published in 1960. He wrote it throughout the 50s. He tried to have it published in 1960, but it was turned down, as he probably knew it would be. I myself am surprised he was not arrested for having written the novel. The Soviet authorities said at the time that this manuscript would not see the light of day for another 2 centuries. As it turned out, it was smuggled out of the Soviet Union and published in Switzerland in 1980. Polly Jones, in the introduction, runs through these facts. It was first published in the Soviet Union in 1988 under Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, or openness. And that was as the Soviet Union was being dismantled and returned to capitalism and nationalism. Soviet Union broke up into its various republics, the largest of which being Russia. So Grossman was very courageous in writing this book. The book is, for that reason, a very important book. It's a serious novel. It is, for my money, the best single work of literature about World War II that I know of, fiction or nonfiction. It teaches us things about war, about human beings in war. It teaches us things about the Soviet Union and people under a totalitarian regime. And being more specific, it teaches us about Stalinism and the Stalinist bureaucracy, how it worked and what effects it had on the citizens of the Soviet Union. Let us just launch into a bit of a history lesson. And that's how we'll spend this video before getting into the novel itself. As I said, the novel is centered on the siege of Stalingrad through the fall and winter of 1942-43. It is not a spoiler to tell you that the Germans were stopped at Stalingrad. As Grossman makes clear, the encirclement of Germany's Sixth Army by Soviet forces is the turning point in the war. From that point on, the European theater of World War II is primarily the story of Germany's slow, forced retreat before the Red Army. Hitler invades the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, breaking the so-called Stalin-Hitler Pact. He launches Operation Barbarossa. And Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was named after a 12th century emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick Barbarossa, who tried to establish German dominance in Europe. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in history. Germany sent almost 4 million troops eastward along a front that stretched from the Gulf of Finland in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Up to 80% of German troops deployed in World War II were committed to the Eastern Front and the war against the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was a war of extermination. The German so-called Barbarossa Decree, issued by Hitler in March of 1941, before the invasion, stipulated that military justice would not apply to the Wehrmacht, to the German army. to German soldiers who committed war crimes in the Soviet Union. In short, Soviet civilians, particularly political and intellectual leaders, communists, and Jews, were to be killed. The Nazis were committed to the eradication of what they called Judeo-Bolshevism. Russians and Slavs generally were also claimed by Nazis to be inferior to Germans, and so were fair game for the Wehrmacht. Important to know, for beginning to read Life and Fate, is that throughout the second half of 1941 and the first half of 1942, the Germans drove the Soviets eastward, through Ukraine and deep into Russia, laying siege to Moscow, Leningrad, formerly called St. Petersburg and Petrograd, and as far as the Volga River, where German forces were concentrated in a siege on the industrial city of Stalingrad. While the novel opens in the autumn of 42, all the main characters have backstories that account for where they were during 1941, during the time when the Soviets were being defeated and driven back. Germany would lose up to 80% of its war dead on the Eastern Front, 4 million soldiers. Estimates vary, but the Soviet Union would lose between 22 and 27 million people in World War II, including 8.7 million military personnel and more than twice as many civilians. It was by far the greatest loss of life suffered by any nation in the war. For perspective, the U.S. lost above 400,000 military personnel. The U.K. lost over 400,000 people in total, military and civilian, in World War II. That's a very macroscopic look at the historical context in which Life and Fate is set. But one aspect that makes Life and Fate so extraordinary, that leads to its being talked about in the same breath as Tolstoy's War and Peace, is that its historical context and history itself are major subjects of the work. As I'll make clear in another video, I have a fundamental disagreement with Grossman's vision, his interpretation of 20th century history. Nevertheless, Grossman's novel is the finest work of literature about World War II that I am aware of, as I said. I'll have more to say about that, but first it's necessary to look more closely at the history if we want to read Life and Fate, even for the first time. On almost every page, Life and Fate is a book about Stalinism. The characters are oppressed by Stalinism, politically, physically, and psychologically. They live in fear of the Stalinist bureaucracy and its security branch, the NKVD. Grossman takes us to a penal camp, where we witness in the stark realism and psychological depth that so elevate this novel the practiced dehumanization of the Zeks, or prisoners. In particular, the prison camps are organized to especially punish the intellectuals and political prisoners who are thrown into barracks with hardened criminals. The threat of the Gulag and of the brutal political prisons such as the Lubyanka in Moscow hangs over the head of Colonel Novikov as he drinks with Getmanov in a bunker. It lurks on the streets as Victor walks with Maria Ivanovna. It sits silent in a corner of Sokolov's apartment as his friends discuss politics, always watching, always listening. Sometimes phones in rooms were actually bugged, but much more effectively, the bureaucracy relied on informants and regular citizens to denounce each other. But what was Stalinism? What was the history and what were the characteristics of the murderous totalitarian government under the ruthless Joseph Stalin? To attempt even the beginnings of an answer to this question, and it is a critical question for reading Life and Fate, we have to go back at least to 1917. Remember, Grossman was writing in Russian for a Russian and Soviet readership primarily, a readership that would have lived through the history his novel chronicles and alludes to. He could take for granted that his readers knew what a Menshevik was and what it meant when a character says 1937. So in 1917, and it will sound strange to Americans who are accustomed to thinking of the 20th as the American century, but any serious objective study of the 20th century has to recognize the centrality of the October Revolution, in which the Socialist Bolshevik Party overwhelmed the bourgeois, the pro-capitalist provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky. The Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who went by the name of Lenin. Other leaders of the Bolshevik Party were Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Nikolai Bukharin. These were important individuals in the revolution, particularly Lenin and Trotsky. But history is not simply a film or a story with heroes and villains, great men and great women who decide where humanity will go next. History is a product of deeper social and political forces, tectonic forces. To pursue that metaphor, history's tectonic forces are never at rest. They're always at work, sometimes almost imperceptibly. And occasionally there is an earthquake, plowing old rock under and thrusting new rock to the surface. As Lenin said, there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. History expresses itself through great figures like Lenin and Trotsky, but most importantly, it expresses itself through masses of people. The Russian Revolution of October 1917 was the expression of the tectonic stress between the capitalist, factory-owning, and financial class on the one hand, and the masses of oppressed factory workers on the other. Lenin's revolutionary program promoted a dictatorship, but not a dictatorship of Lenin over Russia. Rather, he called for a dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasants over the resources and social formations of the country. The proletariat was and is a social class. Proletarians are the urban and suburban industrial workers under capitalism. It's crucial to understand, however, that the Bolshevik program was internationalist. Capitalism is a global economic system, a system of ownership and distribution. Trotsky had recognized by 1905 in his book Permanent Revolution that there existed in the world a global economy. The proletariat, then, was a global class, and the socialist revolution, to succeed, ultimately had to be an international revolution. Lenin and Trotsky's revolutionary program closely aligned with the directional thrust of historical forces, which is to say, it was a highly progressive program. Now, I said that Lenin promoted a dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. A word about the Russian peasantry. The Bolshevik Revolution promised social and economic liberation for Russia's poor peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. In a larger sense, though, it promised to bring Russia out of the vestigial dominance of feudalism, a social force, feudalism, whose time had long since passed in the industrialized world. Russia was a backward country. It had peasants. Some of these peasants were very, very poor and uneducated. Some of the peasant class was more wealthy. They owned land and owned other peasants. There was, by 1917, no longer ownership of people, of peasants, of serfs, as that had been ended in the 19th century, just as ownership of people in the United States was ended in the 19th century. Now, while Lenin was leading proletariat and peasants class forces, it was the proletariat who were to become the leaders of tomorrow. They were the true force driving the revolution. The peasant class was not a revolutionary force. It was a backward force from a system of economy and social organization that had been eclipsed. So this is an important concept for understanding Bolshevism, for understanding Marxism, and for understanding the background knowledge of life and fate. A word about democracy. While Lenin used the term dictatorship, a dictatorship of the proletariat and peasants, this dictatorship was within itself democratic. Lenin depended upon the support of the proletariat. The proletariat, however, was not simply a passive mass of humanity that was allowing itself to be led willy-nilly by Lenin. The proletariat in Russia was highly politically active. That's why there was a Russian Revolution. The workers of the Putilov factory in Petrograd, for example, debated, argued, and voted on measures, including ultimately the measure to undertake revolution and overthrow the provisional government of Kerensky. The vision for the Soviet Union was a vision of republics who were politically run by Soviets, committees, all sorts of committees, workers' committees, community committees. These committees were democratic, and the form of government was to be a form called democratic centralism. Full democracy and freedom of debate in determining policy, and then complete discipline in enforcing the policy. So democracy was an important element to the Russian Revolution and to Bolshevism. We are accustomed in the US to thinking of democracy and socialism as being antithetical. It is instead capitalism that is antithetical to socialism, not democracy, a political formation. It is the economic system of capitalism that is the target of socialist revolution, not democracy itself. Now, the old Bolsheviks, capital O, capital B in Life and Fate, characters in the book such as Mostovskoy, who is a prisoner in one of the Russian gulags, penal camps. The old Bolsheviks maintain in this novel a loyalty to the principles of the October Revolution, which most of them understood as having been betrayed by Stalin and the bureaucracy. The principle of democracy, of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of press. These freedoms were done away with by Stalin. And so the term Stalinism refers to a regime that has eliminated such freedom. As we'll see, Vasily Grossman has a particular interpretation of the history of the Soviet Union, which I will challenge later on. But he is correct in placing Mostovskoy, the old Bolshevik, in a prison. And that is largely because of what happened in 1937. In 1937, 36 and 37, Stalin oversaw a series of what we call show trials. Trials of individuals for terrorist acts, for an assassination, and for conspiring to assassinate Stalin and overthrow the revolution of Lenin. The show trials were all lies. What Stalin was doing with these trials, which would bring people into the dock and sentence them either to summary execution or to imprisonment in the gulag system, or to what Grossman identifies as 10 years without right of correspondence. That was code within the Soviet government for execution. And so anyone who got the sentence of 10 years without right of correspondence actually was executed. Hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of the show trials and the subsequent purges that the Communist Party made in 37. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million. All the old Bolsheviks, the entire class and generation of the party from 1917, who had not entirely capitulated to the Stalinist bureaucracy, were eliminated. They were called enemies of the people. And the number one enemy of the people, according to Stalin, was Trotsky. Now, Trotsky was Stalin's greatest adversary. It was Trotsky whom the ailing Lenin wanted to take the reins of leadership of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union upon Lenin's death. This information was kept from the government and from the people, and a bureaucracy that elevated a man who had been essentially a non-entity in the revolution, Stalin, elevated him to the role of leader of the Communist Party, leader of the Soviet Union. Trotsky was the old Bolshevik extraordinaire. He led what would be called the left opposition. The left opposition, and you can read about this at length in the works of a Soviet historian named Vadim Rogovin, who writes a series of books titled, "Was There an Alternative?" What he implies is, was there an alternative to Stalinism? Was there another historical path that the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union could have followed? And the answer is yes, in Rogovin's estimation. They could have followed Trotskyism. Remember that Bolshevism was internationalism. It was an international revolution that was needed. And Lenin and Trotsky in 1917, while they carried out the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, knew that the success of their revolution depended upon a subsequent revolution in Germany and perhaps France and perhaps in Britain. Germany came very close in 1919 to fulfilling that destiny, to having that revolution. And then again in 1923, these revolutions failed. In 1923, it failed largely because of the Stalinist orientation of the Communist Party in Germany. The old Bolshevik principle of internationalism and democracy, these principles were negated by Stalin. They were a mortal threat to Stalin and his corrupt and his corrupt bureaucracy. The bureaucracy was privileged. That's the word I was looking for. Some of them were old Bolsheviks, had been Bolsheviks in the 1917 October Revolution. But they passed from being militant revolutionaries attached to the Bolshevik principles to being the functionaries of the new government. And they became bureaucrats, technocrats, people who found themselves in positions of power, people who found they had access to a little more money, a little better apartment, to a car, and were better off than the average proletarian in the Soviet Union. These privileges, it turned out, were attractive and addictive, and the bureaucracy preserved itself. It preserved itself by bringing out of the wings this fellow Joseph Stalin to oversee the preservation of the bureaucracy. And Stalin oversaw that preservation with an iron fist. He was also preserving his ultimate power. He was one of the most powerful men in the world. And in order to maintain that power, he eradicated every threat he could see or imagine. That included Leon Trotsky. In 1927, Trotsky was kicked out of the Communist Party and sent into exile, first within the Soviet Union at Alma-Ata, then to Principe, an island in Turkey. He made a couple of stops and ended up in Mexico City, where he was provided for by the artist Diego Rivera and his wife Frida Kahlo, the artist. Trotsky lived and continued writing. He was a prolific writer and a brilliant writer, in my estimation. He continued working and writing and leading the left opposition against the Stalinist bureaucracy from Mexico City, and was still seen as so dangerous to Stalin that Stalin had him executed, had him assassinated in Mexico City. And that was in August of 1940, a year before the German invasion of the Soviet Union. We won't get into Trotsky's assessment of fascism and Nazism here. That would be for another video about another book. But it's important to know something about Trotsky, because Trotsky figures not as a character in this book, but as a person to whom characters refer. And the character Krymov, as we'll see, his fate is determined by an encounter he had once with Trotsky. So, Operation Barbarossa sweeps through Ukraine and Russia, eliminates, eradicates, exterminates human beings on a scale never before seen, in systematic technological ways and in rabid, wild, feral ways. The SS, the Gestapo, and the army itself, the Wehrmacht, murdered its way across Ukraine and Russia, with, it must be noted, assistance along the way from anti-Soviet groups in Ukraine, for example, under the name of Stepan Bandera. Ukrainian nationalists rallied around the Nazi ideology and collaborated with the Nazis in the pogroms, the exterminations of Jews that the Nazis perpetrated. All of this history is known by Grossman, and almost all of it is known by his Russian readership. He had a first row seat at all of this history by virtue of being a war correspondent, and he stayed in Stalingrad throughout the entirety of the siege, longer than any journalist, and he embedded with the Red Army. Grossman traveled with the Red Army throughout the remaining years of the war, all the way to Berlin. For this reason, Life and Fate is a tremendously accurate chronicle of World War II as experienced by the Soviet Union and the Red Army. I think we'll draw this video to a close now. I don't want them to drag on too long, neither do you. And in the next video, we'll present a mixture of history and commentary on the novel itself. What I have in mind for these videos is really an introduction to the novel. I will avoid spoilers as much as I can. What I have in mind is a viewer who is approaching the novel for the first time, maybe for a class, if anyone teaches this novel. I don't know if they do. Maybe because you have heard of it, maybe because you have read other of Grossman's books. The prequel to Life and Fate is a book that he called For a Just Cause, and that is titled in its American version, Stalingrad, another enormous novel, a wonderful novel. But I think there is consensus on this, a novel that does not reach the depths of philosophical, psychological, and historical penetration that Life and Fate reaches. So I'm addressing these videos to a first-time reader, and my objective is to help you understand the references that are being made by the narrator and by the characters to historical events and persons. And I will also try to clarify who's who in this very long novel that, like War and Peace, is just chock full of characters. I've read the novel 3 times, and it's the third reading where I really felt comfortable knowing who was who at every stage. This edition of the book provides an index of the characters. And I believe there's also a sort of family tree somewhere in the book. I don't want to show it to you because I won't be quoting long passages from the novel because I don't want to run afoul of copyright law and have the video taken down and maybe get sued. I don't know. I would like to read long passages to you. I would like to provide photographs, but I'm going to avoid violating copyright law as best I can. Anyway, that will wrap it up for this video. And hopefully I will see you for the second video. Bye-bye.